What's going on, guys? Jacob here, and today we're going to talk about exercise selection for hypertrophy. Now, on Instagram, the social media, YouTubes, you're going to see a whole bunch of gurus touting that you need to be performing these overly exotic and mysterious movements in order to maximize muscle growth. And I'm here to set the record straight and let you guys know that you don't need to be doing these ridiculously difficult or complex movements or techniques on certain exercises, and that the basics do work, but what really matters is how we select these movements, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to address what factors do we need to consider when selecting an exercise to be part of our program? Which exercises are best for muscle growth? Is it compound movements? Is it isolation exercises? Is it machines, free weights? Who knows? And how many movements or exercises do we need per muscle group? So first, let's start with functional anatomy. So when considering what exercises we need to choose to be a part of our program, we need to remember that every muscle group has a textbook action that it performs around a specific joint. And I'm going to outline a basic principle that I used to teach my mentorship students in remembering how this functional anatomy relates to exercise selection, and that is joints, actions, and muscles. So obviously at every joint, there is an action performed by the muscles. So when we look at the bicep, it originates in the scapula and it attaches or inserts at the humerus. And the function of the biceps brachii, is to flex the elbow, supinate the forearm, and then flexion of the shoulder. So there's three functions. And I recommend you guys check out exrx.com for a full list of exercises, muscles, and anatomy relating to movement, because they've got some great information over there. And whilst this is a useful starting point, and we can obviously look to the bicep as an example and see that there are three functions that it performs, and hey, maybe should focus on doing some more supination or shoulder flexion to maximize our bicep peak, we need to remember that in selecting exercises, we need to be prioritizing movements that train a muscle group through the action where it has the greatest force potential. And in the example of the biceps, this would be through elbow flexion. Those other functions are simply supplementary or secondary to that. And again, if we use the glutes as an example, the primary function of the glutes are to extend the hips. External rotation and abduction are secondary functions. So if you want to maximize your glute development, you better be training through some hip extension and not just simply performing abduction and external rotation work. However, that's not to say these functions aren't important for total or regional hypertrophy of that muscle. It's just that they need to be additive for completeness and not take away from the bulk of our training, which should be through those high force output functions. And using this line of thinking, so joints, actions, muscles, and then understanding the high force output functions of a specific muscle group, we can apply that to all the other joints and muscle groups. The second factor we need to consider when we're picking a movement is our individual movement potential. So first, let's start with how we are made up. This is what's called our orthopedic profile. In selecting movements, there could be a number of structural differences or abnormalities that are going to impact your ability to perform that movement. And this is where individual differences in program design really start to take shape, and differences in individuals' structure in terms of how their hips are made up, their shoulders, and their lever and limb length can really influence what exercises we select, or what exercises are going to best fit that person when it comes to building muscle, training for strength. And the reality is that some people aren't able to perform the textbook functions without pain or discomfort, or some real difficulty in getting into certain positions, and we need to be mindful of that and make sure that when you're selecting exercises, you take this into account. For example, at the hip, some individuals, their acetabulum is shaped in such a way that when they squat or go into deep hip flexion, they get impingement through the femoral head and the acetabulum, and they get pain when they squat below parallel. For this reason, maybe squats to full depth may not be a great idea, and instead partial range of motion or even leg press or some other variation may be better suited to that individual. The second factor of individual movement potential is functionality. So assuming that you have the structure, that is the bone and the genetic makeup to perform specific movements and to get into these positions, you may have tightness, weakness, or imbalances that affect your movement and how you perform these exercises. And I'm no professional on this, so if you do, I recommend that you seek out professional help from a registered physiotherapist, chiropractor, healthcare professional, and get that sorted out, because often this can be the cause of injury, pain, discomfort, and ultimately a lot of lack of enjoyment in your training, and something that you need to think about when you're picking movements to be part of your program. The third important factor when we're selecting exercises as it relates to our individual movement potential is range of motion. So we often hear in fitness circles, especially in the bodybuilding community, that we need to train through a full range of motion to maximally recruit our muscles and to get big and jacked. However, what is often forgotten is that we need stability and control through that range of motion. So there's no point increasing range of motion or selecting exercises that allow you to train through a full range of motion if you can't control that range of motion. For example, you might have very limited control or strength through the bottom end range on your deadlift like I do, and if you're pulling heavy weights off the floor, you might get some slight lumbar flexion, which is compensation for that lack of strength and control, and you might blow your lower back. Now, if our goal is hypertrophy, then this is not ideal. We need to be training through a range that is safe so that we don't get hurt, because if we get hurt, we're going to be on the sidelines. So again, another important consideration, and just to wrap up the movement potential side of things in terms of exercise selection, just make sure that you're structurally suited to those movements, or that you're modifying them to best suit your individual needs. You have the function, that is the mobility, stability, and control to perform, and you're using a range of motion that you have strength and stability through so that you don't get hurt. So when we're selecting exercises, we need to think about whether or not we're going to choose compound movements or isolation exercises, or a combination of both. Now, to understand this a little bit better, compound exercises are simply multi-joint movements that train a number of muscle groups and are typically going to recruit more motor units, more muscle fibers, and elicit a greater training effect when compared to isolation exercises, which are training a smaller pool of fibers through a specific joint action. And there's no such thing as an isolation movement, because in any exercise, we can't isolate one muscle group. Other muscles are performing additional roles, such as being a fixator, that is stabilizing, being a synergist, assisting the movement, or being an antagonist, which is opposing that movement. So there's no such thing as an isolation exercise. However, there are single joint movements. And what's important to remember is that with multiple joints being trained, we're training more muscle groups, which is extremely beneficial for hypertrophy, because we're recruiting more muscle, we're placing more tension on those muscles as a result of being able to lift heavier loads, and simply it's going to be very efficient in terms of the time that it takes to get a training effect on the muscle groups. So some really big ticks to multi-joint movements there. However, not all volume is created equally, and when we train multiple muscle groups and use these heavier loads in our compound exercises, they're typically going to bring with them more fatigue. And with more fatigue, that can limit our training volume, and we know that for hypertrophy, muscle growth, training volume is extremely important. So the addition of isolation exercises to our compound movements can be useful, because typically those single joint exercises aren't going to elicit as much systemic fatigue as those compound exercises. And too large an emphasis on compound movements may mean that you're not using your toolbox effectively, because a lot of these smaller muscle groups aren't going to get adequate attention through those big compound movements, and we may need to pick some single joint exercises that specifically target that muscle group and train it through its primary anatomical function if we want to maximize our growth. And we can use the deltoid As an example, whilst we train the deltoid, the anterior deltoid, through most pressing variations, that medial head, that smaller part of the shoulder, gets very minimal attention, and we may need to add in some side raises to make sure that we get those big cap delts that we're after. And an important note on this is that most compound exercises, because we're training more muscle groups and more joints, will have a larger skill component, meaning that selecting some exercise, especially if they're free weights, but more on that in a minute, will take longer to master. And in learning a movement pattern, we're simply not going to be able to use loads heavy enough to elicit a growth response. Therefore, if we're in that phase of our development and we're still learning how to squat, bench, deadlift, and we can't use heavy enough loads to get that training effect that we need to build muscle, we may need to be using our isolation or single joint exercises to top up and ensure that we're getting some tension and some hard training in there whilst we're learning. And when it comes to machines versus free weights, a lot of barbell enthusiasts will pick those free weight exercises with barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells to make up the bulk of their program, and rightly so, because these exercises are great teachers of movement and increasing our proprioception, body awareness, and just developing the skill of lifting, which I think is very useful. However, when we select exercises, we need to consider force vectors, and that is, the way that gravity acts upon the muscle group and how the line of pull and push is directing that tension and how we overcome that. And all weight is going to move vertically. However, machines can change the line of pull and push because the pulley system and the way they're put together is designed in such a way to maximize the line of pull and push for a particular muscle group. And this can help target a muscle group according to its anatomy, which is, again, for hypertrophy, very, very important. And if you're a barbell enthusiast and you refuse to use machines for some of those small muscle groups, then you're going to potentially be limiting your gains. And I recommend that you broaden your horizons and start to use all the tools in your toolbox if hypertrophy is your goal. For example, we can look at the deltoid. Again, like I said, that medial deltoid, it's a smaller muscle group, and if we use only dumbbells and free weights to train the medial head of the deltoid, we're only going to be able to train it through a shortened position because the line of pull, gravity is pulling down, and through this bottom end of the range of motion down here, the deltoid isn't going to be getting a lot of tension at all, if any, and we can use machines or the cable pulley to perform a leaning cable side raise, which trains the deltoid through that lengthened position. So we get to train it through its full anatomical range of motion. And again, for maximal development, this is really important. And this is where machines can really complement our free weight exercises. The fifth factor in selecting an exercise is loadability. So if you haven't checked out my video on progressive overload already, make sure you check it out, because you'll know that there are two things that we need to maximize muscle growth, and that is a greater magnitude of tension over time or a greater duration of tension over time. Now, when we're selecting exercises, we need to make sure that they can be loaded, and how they're loaded is going to influence the types of progression that we add to those. So if we want to be in a phase where we're looking to add a greater magnitude of tension, that is load on the bar, then picking free weight compound movements will be a great idea. However, if we're in a phase where we want to be adding reps and getting some more metabolic stress or duration of tensioning, then selecting exercises that allow themselves or lend themselves better to repetition progressions is a great idea, and this is where your isolation movements come in. And a lot of common sense should dictate this, but again, it's worth mentioning because some people will select exercises that just simply make it very difficult to overload, and those exercises that have a high stability requirement will make this more of an issue. For example, doing your curls on a Bosu ball or any form of exercise that has a high stability requirement will limit the amount of tension that you can place on the muscle, because you have to stabilize in order to overcome that resistance, which means generally you'll be able to use lighter loads. And whilst this is useful for rehab and prehab purposes, in the context of hypertrophy and in building muscle, we want to be picking movements that don't have a great stability demand, because it means we can load them up and lift heavier weights. This is why bilateral movements, for the most part, are going to be really useful, such as your squats, your deadlifts, your bench press, overhead press, your rows, things like that, because they're isn't that great a deal of stability requirements when compared to unilateral exercises. And whilst unilateral movements may be beneficial in helping reduce asymmetries or any imbalances that may occur, again, because we're training one muscle or one side at a time, we're going to have to stabilize the other side, and this may reduce the amount of tension that we can elicit, and usually means lower loads, less reps, all the rest of it. The sixth factor we need to think about when selecting exercises is appropriate loading zones and making sure that the exercises we do choose are fitting the repetitions and loading schemes that we've selected, as I started to touch on before. Now, we know through the scientific literature that there are two mechanisms of hypertrophy. Number one is mechanical tension, so the amount of tension like I discussed earlier, and number two is metabolic stress. So it's important to bear in mind that some exercises are self-selecting towards those lower end rep ranges with heavier weights, such as squats. On the other end of the spectrum, we have movements that are going to be more beneficial in those higher rep ranges and training for a greater duration of tension, such as our leg extensions. And making sure that the exercise we select fit the loading zones and the repetition parameters that we want to be using for our specific phase of training is very, very important. And to a large degree, your preference can dictate this, because we've seen in the research that a wide spectrum of repetition ranges and loading zones can be used to build muscle. So if you're somebody who likes heavier weights, then make sure that you're selecting those compound exercises that lend themselves better to loading progressions. And if you're somebody who just doesn't like those heavy weights and you like keeping your joints healthy and lifting through those higher rep ranges and getting a bit more metabolic stress, then that's completely fine too. But again, make sure the exercises that you select lend themselves towards that rep range. You probably don't want to be doing squats for 15 to 20 reps. But do consider that with heavier loads, there's also going to be more central and systemic fatigue and potential joint stress over time, which, if your goal is hypertrophy, could potentially hinder your long-term progress, especially if it does lead to injury. So this is where, varying your repetition ranges and loading zones can be useful, and having many tools in the toolbox, that is your exercises, and knowing how to pick them appropriately towards these rep ranges and loading zones will be useful long term in keeping you in the gym and keeping your body healthy. And the final point I want to mention is time availability and preferences. If you don't like an exercise, when it comes to building muscle, you don't have to perform it. We are very, very fortunate as physique athletes that we don't have to perform any specific movement, and we don't get up on that stage and have the judges critique us and assess our squat form. They're just looking at our physique, and the body doesn't know what movements you're selecting or what repetition ranges you're performing or how heavy the weight is on the bar. They only understand tension, like I've discussed earlier. So make sure that you pick movements or apply tension in a way that you enjoy, because if you enjoy it, you're going to do it for a long time, you're going to train hard, and that's where the magic happens. The second consideration is time availability. If you're somebody who's poor on time, or you just simply can't get to the gym as frequently or train for as long, then selecting those movements that are bang for buck or going to elicit high amount of tension for less repetitions is going to be very, very beneficial. So make sure the bulk of your training is consisting of those compound exercises. But if you are somebody who trains more frequently and has more time to train per session, a combination of both compounds and those single joint exercises is going to be your best bet in trying to build muscle. So some take-home points for you guys. To maximize regional hypertrophy, we want to be selecting 2 to 3 exercises as a rule of thumb per muscle group, and we can tend to scale this up or down depending on the number of insertions at that specific joint. For example, the back has a lot more attachments than the elbow. Therefore, we probably only need 1 to 2 exercises for the bicep, and we might need 4 to 5 for the upper back. Use a combination of both free weights and machines to maximize strength curves. Remember that compound movements are typically going to be best suited to load progressions and those heavier loading zones, especially if they're free weights. Isolation exercises are going to lend themselves better to repetition progression, and those single joint movements, machine work, will often be better suited towards those loading zones and repetition ranges. But a mixture of both compound and isolation exercises is going to be your best bet to make sure that you're exposing those muscle groups to maximize your training volume and ensure those smaller muscle groups are getting sufficient attention. So guys, I hope this video was useful. I hope you found it informative. If you did, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll speak to you all next time.